Hey everyone, and thanks for tuning in to another Atlas Wellness webinar. I'm Samantha, a registered dietitian and the wellness coordinator for Atlas. Building on last week's wellness focus on stress, this week we'll go a little more in depth into a related topic, emotional eating. And I know this is a really big thing for a lot of people right now, being stuck at home during the quarantine and all the different emotions that are going around during this time. And so my goal for today is to help shed some light on emotional eating and help you think of some ideas for getting through this time. And I also wanted to make a quick plug for our cooking demo this week on Thursday, which will be a particularly exciting topic, healthier desserts. And many people tend to be drawn toward desserts and sweets due to emotional eating, and so this week we'll be doing 3 different mini dessert recipes, so definitely one you'll want to tune in for. So we'll start out by talking about what emotional eating is and what causes it, and then we'll talk about some tips for addressing emotional eating, and we'll end with some resources if you would like additional support. Before we jump in, I just wanted to give this disclaimer that this information is intended as general advice only, and that if you suspect that you have an eating disorder or feel that your emotional eating symptoms are overwhelming, debilitating, or interfering with your quality of life, I would encourage you to seek professional assistance either from your medical provider, a mental health professional, or from a registered dietitian like myself. We'll start out by talking about what emotional eating is. Emotional eating is eating for reasons not related to hunger for physical sustenance. And so often what comes to mind when we think about emotional eating is eating for negative emotions like being sad, angry, anxious, lonely, or tired. But emotional eating can also involve eating for positive emotions like happiness or being excited or feeling nostalgic. Emotional eating might occur when we find ourselves in certain situations like being stressed or bored or even in a celebration. It can also manifest as having specific cravings or using food as a reward, or even overeating. So when we are eating for hunger-related reasons, but we eat beyond that point for emotional reasons. And an important distinction to make is that emotional eating can be eating both quote-unquote healthy or unhealthy foods. And I think a lot of times people get hung up on the labeling, but either way, it doesn't matter because emotional eating is going to be the same cause and the same mechanism no matter what. So just something to keep in mind. And ultimately, emotional eating is a coping mechanism or a response to these internal and external stimuli. And that doesn't inherently mean that it's a bad thing. It just is. It's just a response that our bodies have to certain situations. It's when emotional eating becomes your primary emotional coping mechanism that it really becomes problematic. And so you might get into this cycle where you start to feel that it's uncontrollable, and that's really what we're talking about here. And we'll get into that next. So here is that emotional eating cycle. So it starts out here where you're having a stress or a negative emotion, and that leads you to seek comfort by eating. And eating the food will give you some relief, but ultimately, once that passes, you'll feel guilt and shame about the fact that you ate when you weren't hungry, or maybe the specific eating choices you made during that time, and that will ultimately build more on these negative emotions and stress you're feeling and leave you more susceptible to the next trigger. So it turns into this vicious cycle that can be really challenging to break. It's important to distinguish whether or not you are eating for emotional reasons or if you're actually hungry. So for example, a lot of people struggle with nighttime snacking and attribute that to being bored or eating for comfort reasons, when actually it might be that the physical hunger piece could have been there and now it's the emotional piece that's kind of taking hold. And this is a really important thing to be aware of because it can guide how you might go about finding a solution. So let's review the difference between the two. Physical hunger occurs gradually and kind of waxes and wanes over time, whereas emotional hunger tends to come on very suddenly and feel very urgent. Physical hunger often happens several hours after eating, whereas emotional hunger can happen any time of day, regardless of when you ate your last meal. Physical hunger has physical symptoms like stomach growling or feeling empty, weak, or irritable. Emotional hunger tends to have more mental symptoms, so cravings, thinking about food, that kind of stuff. And physical hunger disappears when you're full, when you're satisfied, whereas emotional hunger persists despite fullness and can be really hard to satisfy, and that's one of the key differentiating factors. And here are some factors that studies have been found to be linked to emotional eating. So one of the biggest ones is dietary restraint or dieting, which has physical and psychological consequences. So physically, dieting can throw off your appetite regulation and leave you more susceptible to eating for non-hunger reasons. And psychologically, dieting intensifies the cravings for off-limits foods and comes along with a lot of shame and guilt and mental side effects whenever a mistake is made, which can really send people off into that emotional eating cycle. Another factor is poor awareness of hunger and satiety. So a lot of people have conditioned their bodies to eat according to external stimuli rather than following the natural ebb and flow of hunger and fullness throughout the day. And so this can lead people to eat when they aren't truly hungry or eat beyond a point of fullness. Another thing studies show is that people who have difficulty identifying and describing their feelings to others have higher rates of emotional eating, which is related to poor emotional regulation and stress management. So ultimately in these situations, the food becomes the outlet for the emotions and the stress rather than actually addressing the problem or finding a healthier coping mechanism. So if anything we just discussed sounds familiar to you and you think you might suffer from emotional eating, here's what you can do about it. First of all, I wanted to take a moment to dispel a really common method of approaching emotional eating that a lot of people follow, which is the advice of keep busy or do something to distract yourself so that you won't eat. And this idea is really problematic because it's just avoiding the issue rather than addressing it. All the emotions are still there. They're just waiting to burst the second you put down the book or the phone or whatever you're distracting yourself with. So instead, let's look at some ideas for actually addressing both aspects of the emotions and the eating. In addressing the emotional side of things, the first step is to increase your awareness. So check in with yourself regularly and think about what emotions you're feeling. Try writing them down or actually saying them out loud, because remember, not being able to name or describe your emotions was one of those causal factors of emotional eating. Next, it's important to identify your triggers. So know which emotions or situations tend to drive you toward food so that you can be more prepared for when they happen. You'll also need to explore other coping mechanisms, so finding other ways to handle your stress or emotions. Reframing your mindset's a really important one. So remember that guilt and shame fuel that emotional eating cycle. It's one of the links in there. And so it's really important that you try to quit the negative self-talk and try to increase positive self-talk and validation and self-compassion so that you can really make sure that that link isn't connecting. And also taking pauses. So when you feel that your emotions are starting to get all revved up and driving you toward the food, just take a minute and stop, think, and breathe. Sit with those emotions for 5 minutes. It's probably going to be pretty uncomfortable at first, but it's really important to work through, because after sitting with those emotions, you're still craving that food, then you can allow yourself to have it, practicing this next set of tips. And now for the eating side of things, one really important thing is to make sure that you're eating enough throughout the day. So this will help you, again, differentiate between that physical and emotional hunger and make sure that that emotional hunger can't take hold. Another important thing is to give yourself unconditional permission to eat food. So keeping that problem food out of your house, like a lot of people do, is just another method of distraction, and it actually doesn't address what the food is doing. Studies show also that when you deprive yourself of certain foods, it only intensifies that craving, and you'll have less self-control when you're faced with that food again, which you inevitably will be. So instead of just refraining from buying that chocolate, keep it in your house and give yourself permission to eat it. This will help you destigmatize that food in your brain and take it off of its forbidden pedestal, bringing it back down to being just another food, and it'll help you regain your control, because the appeal of it being off limits won't be so enticing to you anymore. And this can be a really scary thing for a lot of people to work on, but it is an important step to take, and if you would like some help in this, I can certainly help you. Another major component of addressing emotional eating is mindful eating. So this calls for having an increased awareness of what's going on inside and outside of your body throughout your eating experience. Being more mindful in your eating can help you take back that control over food. So one of the first things is, again, to check in regularly with your hunger and fullness, and helping you distinguish between that physical and emotional hunger. Another important thing is the eating environment. So physically sit down in a designated eating space without electronics or distractions. Eat with positive people, positive conversation. Just make the experience as pleasant as possible. This will help you focus on the food and really tune in with your body. Another thing is to eat on a plate and watch your portion size. So rather than eating right out of the container, physically putting it on a plate will help you be more mindful of what you're eating and how much. And you can start with smaller portions, knowing that you can always go back for seconds. Savor and indulge without overeating is a really important part of giving yourself permission to eat what you actually want to eat. So, for example, if you are craving ice cream, go for your favorite flavor rather than going for a low-calorie alternative that ultimately won't satisfy your craving and will leave you back to craving it shortly after. So indulge mindfully by sitting down, eating in a pleasant environment, really savoring each bite, making observations of what you taste and what you see and what you smell, really making it a whole experience that you get the most out of whatever you're eating. And then a final tool that's really helpful in mindful eating is food journaling. So this can help you track your hunger and fullness, your observations before, during, or after meals. It'll really help to just bring all of these different things into your awareness as you're really trying to start out in this whole journey. And since working through all of this emotional eating process can be a really daunting and intimidating journey to go through alone, I wanted to end with some resources for you. So first of all, I'm always here, Samantha, the Atlas registered dietitian. My email's here if you want to set up an appointment with me. We can work on any of the things we talked about or, kind of figure out what's going on for you and troubleshoot some of that stuff. If you do feel like you're more on the disordered end of things or have an eating disorder, you can also come talk to me, and I have training in that area and can help walk you through some screening processes and help guide you to your next steps of care. If you're in that situation, another good resource is the EAP. You can call their number or go on their website, and they can also connect you with health and mental health professionals. And thank you for tuning in. I hope that you found some of this information useful and that it'll help get you through this really difficult emotional time. Again, don't hesitate to reach out if you need anything from me. Thank you.